Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm out in the garden walking. I was listening earlier to Eric Weinstein and Tim Ferriss. Very interesting minds. I certainly have a lot in common with how Eric thinks about many features of what is broken in our society and educational systems. And the kind of terrible inhibitions that are visited upon us, not merely in childhood, but all throughout our lives, as the worst common denominator of culture, ideas, identity, models, theories, declarations, so on. And I think, like Eric, I dream of establishing cultures that nurture and support and recognize and celebrate the incredible prodigy that is our natural way of being as human beings. But unfortunately, many of the assets that underlie this natural prodigy are captured, held prisoner, denied, obscured, counterfeited, and sold back to us in really toxic ways. But every human being aches for freedom. And by freedom, I don't mean necessarily the capacity to do whatever one wishes. As we can see with modern culture, one has to have very good wishes, really deeply beautiful, noble, honorable, divine wishes or desires. These must be sustained, otherwise we easily collapse into kind of devastating consumerism where we just wish for something to relieve the pain, the drudgery of all that is missing from our lives and roles and relationships. And once we've been reduced to this situation, then we just wish for things to consume or buy, or own, profit from. Value really disappears from our experience and is replaced by various kinds of convenience. And even for those people who are wealthy enough to be freed from many of the agonies of poverty, they're still empty inside. And they can't buy back the things that would fulfill the needs of their interiority. And even our interiority becomes impoverished in isolation, and when the contexts that we're enmeshed in keep lowering the bar of our humanity, so that we cannot even recognize ourselves anymore. The faculties with which we might do so over time have degraded. So I think what I mean by the freedom we ache for is the freedom to know and embody deeply and meaningfully our potential as human beings. And much of that urge, that desire, is not really for ourselves. We want, I think, liberation for all of the human beings. And then, if we remember our origins and our families, for all beings. We want all beings to have the opportunity to experience the fulfillment of the promise of their incarnation as material beings. And you can see this desire even in very small children, or the animals we refer to as pets, when they come to us wanting to play together. Perhaps because in play we achieve a position beyond our ordinary roles, our habitual roles. I saw a video of a coyote clearly attempting to play with a beaver. And I think this was such a novel experience for the beaver, not quite as much for the probably young coyote. I also suspect it was a male coyote. That the beaver wasn't really sure how this game worked. Nonetheless, it could easily have departed or threatened the coyote. And it did give a little tail slap on the water, turn around and slapped its tail on the water toward the coyote, but maybe that was the beaver experimenting with play, because the beaver is a powerful enough animal that if it decided the coyote was any kind of significant threat, which ordinarily it might be, it's perfectly capable of violence, really powerful violence. This is a creature that cuts down trees with its teeth. Right? Now, it's not as slinky and springy as the coyote is, but it can certainly jump toward the coyote and bite it. Sometimes when we've been deprived of play for a very long time, it's as if the muscle weakens or the faculties involved are submerged. And this is similar with our creativity and our intelligence. The imperatives of our modern contexts and cultures continually lay down inhibitions. And if we are sensitive at all, we have to armor up emotionally, physically, just to survive in the constant bath of noise, machines, artificial lights, toxic chemistries, foods that aren't food, relationships that aren't relationships at all. I think it's very clear that though Eric and I have differing perspectives and unique concerns, we share a deep and abiding love of many similar things. And he and I are both autodidacts. Most of what we've learned, we largely taught ourselves. I left school when I was 12. And by the time I was 14, I was living on the street as a runaway. I've never been to high school. I took a few classes at a junior college in my 20s and ended up co-teaching an English class with Richard Speaks at Santa Rosa Junior College, which was an eye-opening experience. Because 90% of the students there could not successfully write a sentence or paragraph in English. This was probably circa 94, sometime around there. And I was shocked to discover that, probably 70% of those students were B-average high school graduates. And their capacities with the single language that most of them spoke were remedial at best. Now, how could that be so? What leads to a tragedy like that? Of course, I understand very clearly what leads to this tragedy. The question's rhetorical. And just as in any class, there were uniquely gifted, little groups and individuals who, with just a little bit of encouragement, could produce something amazing with their minds and spirits. I loved being in that environment, and for one thing, the social opportunities were vastly increased over the opportunities commonly available to me. More with the students than the faculty. Though Richard was a very deep and gifted and strange man. I'm sure he's passed on by now. I remember one day we were having a conversation about writing and truth and the relationships between language and truthfulness that was very deep. And he said, you can intuitively tell the difference between something that's true and something that's a display, right? A kind of a making of a spectacle. And in my 20s, I discovered the writings of Guy Debord, who was an intellectual that belonged to a clade that acquired the moniker situationists. And he wrote a book back in the day. It used to have a black cover with silver writing on it, called The Revolution of Everyday Life, in which he wrote a scathing indictment of our cultures and their compulsion to fascinate and distract us with spectacles. I think he would be alarmed and feel despair if he saw how much further those processes could go. But as it turns out, he took his own life, an end not uncommon for intellectuals and for specific forms of intellect that eventually become so overwhelmed by their capacity to see the problem and to talk about the problem that they die inside. And it's a troubling propensity. Many of us who are curious and intelligent become critics. And that's not a very fulfilling role. We can see what's wrong, we can point out what's wrong, but we cannot solve the problems. We can merely see into them in ways that are uncommon. And everyone feels the weight of the terrible injustice of collective humanity. And it's a strange problem because it's a relatively recent development in human cognition to even be able to think of the world or of all the humans. For nearly all of our history, our knowledge and concerns were local to our families and relationships and the situations where we lived. And it wasn't possible to speak to people far away or even reasonably travel very far away. Though it seems clear that some of the ancient peoples left their original homes and established new homes elsewhere. So this problem of being able to see the problems, but not being able to address them, it's a kind of disease, right? Literally dis-ease. And it's painful for everyone. Because deep inside us, we know that we have the capacity, the potential to be beautiful together, to become intelligent together, to grow and nurture and support each other and life on earth. to discover the mysteries, to recover our faculties that have long been hidden and counterfeited. For a time in my life, a period of years, due to an unusual experience I had, I finally, the terrible weight, it flipped over. And I could see, instead of just the problem, or the trouble, or the wrongness and its origin and structure, I could see, what we could do instead. And I could do some of what I could do instead. Today, though, I feel the weight of inhibition just as I did before my eyes were opened. And though I can still see what we can do instead, it's easier to become confused and see the problem, the trouble, what's wrong, what's not right. And I think when I was listening to Eric and he was speaking with Tim about issues related to the topic we refer to as social justice. And how it's become dangerous. More and more there are topics that are essentially off limits publicly in society in general, and in particular intellectual circles as well, and academic circles. And they were talking about how the movements for social justice have become kind of ideologically fundamentalist. And it's very interesting, this problem. It's a problem having to do with language and categories taken from outside of meaningful relationships, so they've become abstract. Right? And it's also a problem that emerges from, I think, the very confused idea, however realistic it may be in our time, that human beings are fundamentally individuals, separate ones, and that well, I suppose once that move is made, there's a problem in characterizing the separate ones. And saying, well, these ones have these qualities, and these ones want to be called this, and these ones want to be seen in such and such a way, and those ones don't want that, and so on. And that's a big fucking mess. And part of the reason it's a big fucking mess is that the scope of our individuality, while not entirely imaginary, is really quite limited. Now, in language, it's really easy to lose one's way in thought or evaluation or analysis, because once we have the idea of individuals, we've already become very confused. And it's not that the idea is without value or has no meaning. Rather, it's that the meaning of our individuality is inflected by the contexts that it inherits character from. And the idea of equality is kind of a strange idea in the sense that no two human beings were ever born equal. Right? So there's a scope, again, here, that gets lost when we think about equality. Now, of course, the basic idea is not difficult to understand, and in its most noble enactions is beautiful. But the idea of a constructed equality is a very strange idea, and I mistrust it deeply. We cannot declare to people how they should or must treat or think of or speak of other people. Now, when I say we cannot, of course, absolutely we can, and we is the problem word in this proposition. And I've spoken at length about the problems with that word, so I'll not venture too far in that direction. But equality can't be dictated. It can't be a mandate. That kind of equality quickly becomes easily weaponized. It seems to me that whatever equality we might enjoy and the real road towards something resembling social justice has to do with mutual engagement in each other's well-being and development and health. Because when we are deeply mutually engaged, prejudices tend to fall away rather naturally as we realize, oh, my life depends on the uniqueness of my companion, my companions, my fellow beings. And when we have this realization, it's very difficult to otherize them. There's no motivation to do so, and every motivation to do something else, which is to continue to enjoy the benefits that emerge from our uniqueness. So is everyone equal or is everyone unique? Well, it's hard to say in what ways we are equal. If we really think about, what does equal mean? And in mathematical contexts, it means something like the identity is the same. There are no two beings for whom the identity is the same. And if we were to get really serious about the language and say, well, we have to have a unique word for every kind of uniquely felt embodiment and gender and social class and so on, well, we'd need billions of words. We'd need 7.8 billion words at least, and then more than that. So there's no way to capture equality in language. And we should be, I think, extremely skeptical of propositions and agendas that demand we do so. Now, of course, it's much easier to detect something resembling prejudice in language. But what is the origin of prejudice? The otherizing of our fellow human beings. And I can hear someone thinking, well, that word fellow, that's a masculine word, and right? My critic can detect this. But one of the ways we're not equal is that we are all different ages. And we all came from different places and times and cultural, socio-cultural contexts and educational backgrounds and academic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, vocational backgrounds. So that's certainly not equal, right? That's unique. And this Q sound in these words is important. Q-U, right? Q-U, to cue each other, right? To signal something's up. We have to pay attention to. Though I admit that perspective on language is slightly schizotypal in that it sounds perhaps like a form of apophenia where we see correlations that may not be really justified. It strikes me that whatever measure of equality we may achieve or enjoy together depends fundamentally on relationships, on being mutually concerned and mutually engaged in meaningful roles and activities that weave us deeply into intimacy. So that the urge to otherize is overwhelmed by the fact of our intimacy. Of course, what I'm saying is itself rather abstract. As I walk by myself in the garden. But the idea that we can mandate equality, this is a very dangerous thing. If you tell people what not to do, many of them will naturally do the taboo thing. If you tell people what to do, you'll have the same problem. But if you invite them into a context where their lives and prosperity and opportunities emerge from their mutual intimacy, concern, and connection, then you have a path to something resembling equality. Now, it may be that humans are kind of fundamentally hierarchical. There seems to be some reasonable degree of evidence for this. And we see it everywhere we look in society. Right? The humans form hierarchies. But the constructs in which they're forming hierarchies today are extremely abstract and in fact inhuman. Corporations and governments are not human. We speak of them as if they were beings, but they're not. In fact, they're something like anti-beings. They don't have consciences. Their intelligence is directed primarily toward their propagation, domination, success. They're Thrist-like in this way. And even the exceptions, seeming exceptions, like we might imagine some human rights group, or I mean that idea by itself is really both necessary and very bizarre. Or, a nature conservancy, Greenpeace, something like this. All of these things, these institutions, they take on the peculiarly disembodied, discarnate, abstract imperatives that all institutions have, and they become hierarchical and concerned more with their survival and perhaps reproduction as institutions than with the imperatives around which they were originally formed. So they become businesses. A strange word. Busynesses. I can imagine a world with no institutions like these or businesses. But it's rather difficult to imagine a path to that world from this one. At least at the collective level. Now, at a smaller scale, it's very simple to have something other than businesses and institutions and hierarchies. Though I think hierarchies are part of our heritage as social animals in general. Not necessarily explicit hierarchies, but, the old matron in the gorilla pod, or the dolphin pod. She has a special impact on the others in her group, just as the grandmother does in a human family. And so too the elder males, and when the children play together, they seem to rather naturally forge hierarchies, though it's confusing for many of the children. And there is another way. There's a way where status emerges from the necessities of the moment of relation and activity, rather than being sort of set in stone, imprinted, right? And you can see this in some human endeavors, even where there is something like a hierarchy. You'll see that though there's a hierarchy in a given situation, say in a play on a football field, the entire play depends not on the person who's in charge, but on the person who can create a window of opportunity for the entire team. And so the chance to create a window of opportunity for the tribe or the pod renders hierarchy at least momentarily transparent, or not the most important thing, right? And I can imagine a way of being together where the goal is to lift the opportunity window into accessible how to put this? To create opportunity for the cohort. To raise the bar for everybody. And then to retreat from that position into a position of group identity, so that the group promotes its organs, individuals or subgroups, to a position where they can take advantage of opportunity or create an opportunity that was otherwise inaccessible. And then a certain kind of hierarchy-like structure emerges briefly to take advantage of that opportunity. And then we dissolve back into the tribe, the family, the group. And this, it seems, is a natural aspect of our human nature. But again, it gets captured, represented as formal hierarchies, systems. And thus submerged, lost. But there are ways of playing together where we can rediscover we can retrieve and recover something far more beautiful than mere hierarchy. And it won't make hierarchies go away. Rather, it will recast them in far less toxic and explicit forms. In the garden, I have friends who are birds, and in human language, one could say they jealously defend their relationship with me. The scrub jays do not want me feeding the Steller's jays, and the hummingbirds do not want me feeding any of the jays anywhere near their territory. And this is part of the complex manifold of problems with identity in humans. There are territories and properties. I mean the term properties in both senses. The sense of that which belongs to us, and the sense of particular qualities of relationships or places. And this is part of where the where we acquire not just the concept of self and other, but the inactions of this concept and the imperatives that underlie it. Now, one might think, oh, the humans are just confused and everyone can get along and share. And that's a beautiful vision. But if we go all the way down to the level of biology, we find something broader and more complex than our ideas. And yet, we may also find the origins of our ideas for our immune systems, right? They are one of the primordial arbiters of self and other. And although we use war language to talk about these things, I think that's at least modestly mistaken. Because war, as humans understand it and enact it, is a very different thing from what happens in nature. Much narrower and less diversely in character than what happens in nature. But in our bodies, there isn't just self or other, right? There are territories. There is the heart, the lungs, the nervous system, the brain, the skin, the blood, the lymph, the fascia, the muscle, the hair, the sense organs, the gut, the intestines. And these are all bounded, right? And if something from our intestines escapes the boundary and propagates throughout the body, we get sepsis and may die. Right? So is it ourself attacking ourself? Is it an other attacking ourself? Is it even an attack? It's not clear at all that this language is sufficient to reasonably encompass the phenomenon it points at. And we humans have a problem with too easily transferring a concept from one domain to another without thinking carefully enough about how that might blind us. So the idea that, everyone should live together in harmony, well, it's not entirely true, because different clades have different priorities. And where we live and grow and learn matters. Hey, good to see you. This doesn't mean we can't have an essential respect and concern and love of humans whose traditions and languages and priorities are very different from our own. Any more than the idea that if one looks at one's own hand, it is immediately, concretely apparent that it is the diversity of the members that grants this appendage its astonishing degrees of freedom. Right? But it's not merely their diversity, it's their diversity in union that grants these liberties. Now, there are clades of humans on Earth who, left to their own devices, will kill everything. And there are other clades, and even individual humans, who, if they could raise a threat against all humans or life on Earth, would not hesitate to do so. And this is the ancient problem. Right? Because the peaceful people, the not domineering people, are always at risk of being enslaved by people who are domineering or groups who are domineering. And advertising in our time is a result of this problem. The attempt to capture market share. To convert consumers to fans or brand adherents. And this is one of the really confusing and richly complex problems we face as moderns, where vast, domineering institutions take over aspects of culture and society that should never belong to institutions, that must belong instead to the people. And yet, the people are incapable of understanding or organizing themselves so far in such a way as to disrupt this problem and replace it with something in which we could have faith and trust without having to constantly be questioning whether this is good or true or noble. The boundaries matter, right? You can't erase the boundaries. And when we do this in thought, our minds collapse into very clumsy, crude, deceptive models and ideas. Boundaries are really important in life. And that's why, in part, the scrub jays defend their territory from the Steller's jays. and other interlopers. It's a confusing array of problems. There's no easy path beyond it. Any such path must begin with insight into the nature of self and other, territory and boundaries. And if we can acquire insight about these matters, then we may be equipped to discover and recover and invent ways of being human together that we can trust as being noble or good. Of course, the mess we find ourselves in now is so thickly toxic and complex that it's not very hard to make a better move. And it's really easy to make better moves all day long in small, tightly knit groups. Even a group of two, right? Because that group can liberate itself from the encompassing contexts and establish new terrain, and then move into that terrain for mutual benefit and developmental excellence. I was having a conversation yesterday with a young woman in Quebec, and she was talking to me about her concerns about politics. And she said something very, very interesting, I thought. She said, "Of course I don't want to go into politics, but it seems like it might be a good idea." And that was a really interesting thing to say, because her feeling self clearly saw, this is a miserable thing. Why would I want to do this? But her moral and ethical thoughts were very concerned about the grave injustices swarming around, the socio-political nightmares that we presently exist under and seemingly must support. And someone could raise the argument and say, all these things you're very concerned about, these are incredible luxuries that people in history would have loved to have. Well, that's not untrue, but it depends on when in history we look. Right? It's certainly true in a sense that what we tend to refer to as the standard of living has increased dramatically for nearly everyone, even though there's still abject poverty and staggering greed and wealth existing side by side. But there were many things that had to be sacrificed to acquire, to quote unquote improve the standard of living. And many of those things were like organs of our own bodies, except that rather than being inside us, they're in the living world. And those things were burnt to the ground and tortured and obliterated and cruelly destroyed so that our, quote, standard of living could improve. But it doesn't really matter how much our standard of living improves if our lives are miserably inhibited and our potentials are cruelly circumscribed by contexts so stupidifying that they are themselves diseases. I'll admit, it seems nice to have a safe place to sleep and to not have to worry about being invaded from without. Yet at the same time, surely we can recognize that we're all being constantly invaded from within. It's just a change of venue. Instead of shooting us with guns, they shoot us with media and images and language and ideas that that are crippling to be subjected to. So which kind of war do we prefer? I suppose we prefer the less physically violent war, the more morally violent war, the more intellectually violent war, the subtler kinds of violence that cripple us while leaving us with the ability to continue to walk and work and consume. Of course, who do I mean by we? Well, again, that little word is so dangerous because we use it to invent a cohort that doesn't really exist. Before there's a we, those who belong must agree there's a we and enact that agreement together. Otherwise, what we have is an abstract we, the we of victims, right? We are all victims of thus and such. Or we are all perpetrators of thus and such. I sometimes think of our species as a desperate experiment. And I'm not sure how precisely the experiment originated. It's not entirely clear to me that our species is just another animal that evolved on its own, in nature, as nature, on Earth. Nope, not clear to me. Really not sure about that. We're such a strange anomaly in nature that it seems at least plausible that something else intervened. I'm not sure what precisely intervened. Oh my God. You know, some of the things that presently qualify as music really don't seem to me like music much at all. In fact, you know, I have a model that I developed of how we could transform the internet into something that would give all of us new opportunities and help us learn in astonishing ways and form families and teams to resolve trenchant problems together. And I call it the intelligence amp. But what we're existing in now is something like the opposite of that. It's a stupidity amp. It actually rewards us for lowering the bar wherever, just about wherever we can get away with it. And that's a terrifying situation to find oneself in. And when I was walking past this group of young people, they were playing some music, and the language in the music was terrifying to me. Is terrifying to me. it's not lyrical, it's it's the remains of lyricism. It's the skeletal remains of what might have been lyricism. I'ma throw a bag on you, I'ma spend my gash on you, I'ma blah 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 on you, I'ma on you, you know, this kind of thing. What is that the result of? I mean, as a poet, I watched a peculiar thing happen where lyricism transformed into something more like a militaristic drumbeat. And the flowing, changing music of poesis became like a weapon. And in fact, the language itself, in many branches of this problem, became weapon-like. It was a language of war and ego, egoic war. I'm the best damn thing. I'm the killer. I'm a crush you. I'm a fuck you up. And poetry became like fighting. Now, of course, I don't mean all of poetry. I mean the branch of poetics that collapsed in this direction. I see that as symptomatic of, you know, something really ugly going on. And I suppose I'd rather have a situation where the ugliness produced a symptom so that I would at least recognize it and be able, perhaps if I was so inclined, to trace it back towards its origins and glean the insight that might result from doing so. But personally, I find, with very few exceptions, that entire trend really hideous. And I feel great concern for young people who are raised in that context. What are the priorities that underlie this kind of thing? Yeah. They seem inhuman, cruel, ugly, and yet, you know, they result from histories, right? There's something encoded in them that we can use to understand their origins, and perhaps to perhaps to give answer to the problems that produced these symptoms and continues to exacerbate them and amplify and exaggerate them. Hyperbole. I'll admit that my talk today has been a bit of a bird walk. I'm a little bit tired and had a long couple of days. Perhaps my thoughts are not as organized and coherent as they might be. Nonetheless, I enjoy the travel, reflecting on these things, seeing what useful insights or perspectives I might draw forth from the turmoil. So forgive me if it seems like I don't have a point, because I think I don't. What I have is more of a spiral today. And I hope that you may have found some of it useful or interesting, and I'm very grateful to those of you who join me in my walks. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all walk together one day, talking and questioning, perhaps even arguing, learning, growing, discovering together. That's my dream. That's my goal. That's my hope. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.